Hello again, 122. In this video, we will go over and begin to evaluate why the North Vietnamese communists, led until 1969 by Ho Chi Minh, were able to win control of all of Vietnam. That will lead into the last question of the United States under Presidents Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter establishing their policy of détente. These two questions are kind of connected, and we'll finish 3 in the last video on détente. And there is more conflict in Indochina following World War II. During the mid-1950s, China had sought to build contacts with the non-socialist world, and a ceasefire agreement that brought the Korean War, part of the Cold War that was fought from 1950 through 53, and North Korea and South Korea are still divided at the 38th parallel today. And the ceasefire ended that war in July of 53, and China signaled its desire to live in peaceful coexistence. That's the Khrushchev term that he came up with in 55 and 56 with other independent countries in the region. China doesn't want to have any more conflicts after the Korean conflict. But a relatively minor conflict now began to intensify on China's southern flank in French Indochina. That struggle, as I mentioned, began after World War II when the Indochinese Communist Party, led by Ho Chi Minh, at the head of a multi-party nationalist alliance called the Viet Minh Front. They seized power in northern and central Vietnam. And there's a nice picture of Ho Chi Minh as he's planning an attack on the French. This is a 1950 photograph taken at his secret base in the mountains. And he was constantly changing his headquarters to evade capture by French forces. After abortive negotiations between Ho's government and the returning French, war broke out in December of 1946. French forces occupied the cities and the densely populated lowlands, while the Viet Minh took refuge in the mountains. And for 3 years, the Viet Minh waged a people's war. This is a war of national liberation. And this is one of the reasons why they're going to eventually win and take over all of Vietnam, because they're trying to unify the country against colonial rule. And they gradually increased in size and effectiveness. At the time, however, the conflict in Indochina in the late 40s attracted relatively little attention from world leaders, who viewed the events there as only one aspect of the transition to independence of the colonial territories in post-war Asia. The Truman administration was uneasy about Ho's long-standing credentials as a Soviet agent. Remember, Ho was at the Versailles Conference in 1919. It's seeking independence from Vietnam then, and he's rebuffed. And that sent him then into the Soviet orbit, where he learned Soviet tactics and he became a card-carrying communist. And the Truman administration is also equally reluctant to anger anti-colonialist elements in the region by intervening on behalf of the French. Moscow had even less interest in the issue. Stalin, still hoping to see the Communist Party come to power in Paris, ignored Ho's request for recognition of his movement as a legitimate representative of the national interests of the Vietnamese people. Unbelievable double-cross by Stalin. But what had begun as an anti-colonial struggle by the Viet Minh Front against the French became entangled in the Cold War after the Chinese Communist Party came to power in China. In early 1950, Beijing began to provide military assistance to the Viet Minh to burnish its revolutionary credentials and protect its own borders from hostile forces. The Truman administration now is increasingly concerned that a revolutionary red tide was sweeping through the region, and they decided to provide financial and technical assistance to the French while pressuring them to prepare for an eventual transition to independent non-communist governments in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Despite growing United States involvement in the war, the Viet Minh forces continued to gain strength, and in the spring of 1954, with Chinese assistance, they besieged a French military outpost at Dien Bien Phu. not far from the border of Laos. The French sent reinforcements, and the decisive battle of the conflict was underway. With casualties mounting and the French public tired of fighting a dirty war in Indochina, wow, echoes of that will happen later, the French had agreed to hold peace talks with the Viet Minh in May of 1954. On the day that the peace talks were going to begin in Geneva, Switzerland, Viet Minh forces overran the French bastion at Bien Bien Phu. The humiliating defeat weakened the French resolve to maintain a presence in Indochina. In July, the two sides agreed to a settlement. Vietnam was temporarily divided into a communist northern half known as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and a non-communist southern half based in Saigon, which is today Ho Chi Minh City. That eventually came to be known as the Republic of Vietnam. A demilitarized zone separated the two at the 17th parallel. And there's the map of Indochina after 1954. Now again, the Geneva Accords said that elections were to be held in 2 years to create a unified government. Cambodia and Laos were both declared independent under neutral governments, and French forces were withdrawn from all three countries. China had played an active role in bringing about the settlement and clearly hoped that it would reduce tensions in the area, but subsequent efforts to improve relations between China and the United States foundered on the issue of Taiwan. In the fall of 1954, the United States signed a mutual security treaty with the Republic of China guaranteeing U.S. military support in case of an invasion of Taiwan. That still exists today. And when Beijing demanded that the United States withdraw from Taiwan as the price for improved relations, diplomatic talks between the two countries collapsed. And slowly, the Second Indochina War is going to break out. China's radicalism was intensified in the early 1960s by a renewed outbreak of the war in Indochina. The Eisenhower administration had opposed the peace settlement at Geneva in 1954, which divided Vietnam temporarily into two separate regroupment zones, specifically because the provision for future national elections opened up the possibility that the entire country would come under communist rule. And that's probably what would have happened. But Eisenhower had been unwilling to send U.S. military forces to continue the conflict without the full support of the British and the French, who preferred to seek a negotiated settlement. In the end, Washington promised not to break the provisions of the agreement, but they refused to commit itself to the results. And during the next several months now, the United States began to provide aid to the new government in South Vietnam. And under the leadership of the anti-communist politician Ngo Dinh Diem, the government began to root out dissidents. And with the tacit approval of the United States, Diem refused to hold national elections called for by the Geneva Accords. It was widely anticipated, even in Washington, that the communists would win such elections. And in 1959, Ho Chi Minh, despairing of the peaceful unification of the country under communist rule, decided to return to a policy of revolutionary war in the South. And the actual first American casualties took place in that year of 1959. Later the following year, 1960, a political organization that was designed to win the support of a wide spectrum of the population was founded in an isolated part of South Vietnam, known as the National Liberation Front. It was under the secret but firm leadership of high-ranking communists in North Vietnam, the DRV. So this is another reason why they're going to eventually win. They've got a whole political group organized. And by 1963, South Vietnam was on the verge of collapse. Diem's autocratic methods and inattention to severe economic inequality had alienated much of the population. This is another big key reason. And revolutionary forces, popularly known as the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese communists, and supported by the communist government in North Vietnam, expanded their influence throughout much of the country. And in the fall of 1963, this is just before Kennedy was assassinated, senior military officers overthrew the Diem regime. But the factionalism within the new military leadership, they could not reinvigorate the struggle against the insurgent VC forces, and the situation in South Vietnam grew worse. And by early 1965, the Viet Cong, their ranks now swelled by regular military units infiltrating from North Vietnam, were on the verge of seizing control of the entire country. In March, President Johnson used the Tonkin Gulf incident, which was a U.S. Navy vessel parked off the coast of North Vietnam. They were spying on the country, and the North Vietnamese fired on it. And he asked for Senate approval to send U.S. combat troops to South Vietnam to prevent the total defeat of the anti-communist government in Saigon. And only one senator, Wayne Morse, voted against this. He got the approval. And over the next 3 years, U.S. troop levels steadily increased as the White House counted on U.S. firepower to persuade Ho Chi Minh to abandon his quest to unify Vietnam under communist leadership. And that illustration on page 699 is well worth a read, ladies and gentlemen, because the technology is not going to have a big effect in the Second Indo-Chinese War. And we will conclude this question in the detente video coming next.